A U.S. police officer and his K-9 came to pick up his foster son. What he saw in Class 4B was shocking. The autumn wind whipped through the evergreens of Redwood Ridge, rattling the chain-link fence outside the elementary school. Officer Jonah Pike pulled his patrol jacket tighter, his hand resting unconsciously on the leash of his K-9 partner, Kota. The German shepherd's ears twitched, nose high in the air, every muscle alert. Jonah had come for something simple, just to pick up his foster son, 9-year-old Evan Parker, after math tutoring. But as he approached classroom 4B, a sound pricked his instincts. Silence. Not the soft hum of pencils scratching or the whisper of children sharing secrets, but a heavy, unnatural stillness. Through the narrow window of the classroom door, he saw it. Evan sat rigid at his desk, his hands wrapped in stark white bandages. Leaning close, too close, was his teacher, Miss Vivian Hollowell. Her lips moved near the boy's ear, words too quiet for Jonah to catch, but her posture was unmistakable, predatory, possessive. Evan flinched, his shoulders curling inward as if her whisper burned. Kota let out a low, warning growl, the kind he used on suspects moments before a takedown. Jonah's grip tightened on the leash. His gut told him this was no ordinary tutoring session. Pushing the door open, he stepped inside. Ms. Hollowell straightened instantly, her smile snapping into place like a mask. "Oh, Officer Pike," she said brightly, her hand still lingering on Evan's back. He just got a little emotional over the math problems. Nothing unusual. But Jonah wasn't listening to her words. He saw the flicker in her eyes, the iron grip hidden behind a gentle touch, the way every other child in the room sat frozen, afraid to breathe. And when Kota padded forward, resting his head gently against Evan's arm, the boy's eyes filled with tears of relief. Something was deeply wrong in classroom 4B. Redwood Ridge was the kind of mountain town that looked postcard perfect from the outside. Nestled in Colorado's high country, its streets curved around pine groves and weathered cabins with the Rockies standing guard like eternal sentinels. On Main Street, the diner's neon sign flickered in the evening, and the smell of wood smoke clung to the crisp air. But behind the charm, the town carried secrets. Some whispered in darkened classrooms, some buried in silence. Officer Jonah Pike knew both faces of Redwood Ridge. At 37, he had spent 12 years as a local cop, patrolling winding mountain roads and handling domestic disputes that flared as suddenly as summer thunderstorms. He was respected, steady, and yet there was something in him that kept people at a distance, a shadow. It traced back to the hospital hallway where he had promised Evan's mother, her voice a whisper between breaths, that he would look after her boy. She had passed that winter, leaving Jonah with a responsibility heavier than any badge. Jonah's house stood at the edge of town, modest but solid, its porch light always on. Inside, the smell of coffee and leather clung to the air, and Kota's dog bed occupied the corner like a permanent sentinel. Kota was more than a working dog. At 5 years old, the German Shepherd had been Jonah's partner through countless shifts, tracking lost hikers, holding suspects at bay, standing quietly by the cruiser during long stakeouts. His coat was thick and dark, his eyes sharp amber pools that seemed to see through pretense. To Evan, he wasn't just a K-9. He was a guardian, one who never judged, only protected. Evan Parker, slight for his 9 years, carried the fragility of a child who had seen too much loss too soon. His brown hair fell into his eyes, and his shoulders often curled as if bracing against blows no one could see. At school, he was quiet, a boy who tried to vanish into the background. Teachers marked him polite and withdrawn in reports. But Jonah knew better. He saw the way Evan startled at sudden noises, the way he sometimes whispered apologies for things that weren't his fault. There was another guardian in Evan's life, June Parker, his aunt. She had left a promising marketing career in Denver to move back to Redwood Ridge after her sister's death. June was 32, with a calm warmth that filled Jonah's house when he couldn't. She brought meals, helped with homework, and filled the silence with gentle chatter. Where Jonah was stoic and contained, June was nurturing, often kneeling to Evan's level, reminding him he wasn't alone. Yet despite the love surrounding him, Evan carried scars. The fresh bandages on his hands were only the most visible. He spoke little about school, brushing off questions with a shrug. "It's fine," he would say. But Jonah noticed the way he lingered near Coda after class, the way he seemed to draw strength from the dog's steady presence. And then there was Ms. Vivian Hollowell. To the parents of Redwood Ridge, she was the ideal teacher, poised, well-dressed, with a reputation for firm discipline and high test scores. She was often praised at PTA meetings for bringing order to the rambunctious fourth grade. Her blonde hair was always immaculate, her lipstick always fresh, and her voice sweet as honey in public. But Jonah's instincts screamed that her perfection was too polished, too rehearsed. What Jonah had seen in classroom 4B, the whispered words, the unnatural silence, the fear in Evan's eyes, lodged in his mind like a splinter. Redwood Ridge might look peaceful on the outside, but beneath the surface, something poisonous was spreading, and it had taken root in the very place children were supposed to be safe. The evening after that unsettling moment in classroom 4B, Jonah drove Evan home in silence. The patrol SUV rumbled along the mountain road, headlights catching snowflakes that had begun to fall early in the season. Evan sat buckled in the back seat, his small hands resting on his knees, gaze fixed on the dark window as if the glass itself might keep his secrets. Coda rode beside him, occasionally nudging the boy's arm with his nose, a gentle reminder that he wasn't alone. At home, June was waiting, the porch light casting a warm circle against the cold night. She ushered them in, her voice light but eyes searching. "How was class, champ?" she asked, crouching to help Evan slip off his jacket. "Fine," Evan muttered. The word was automatic, too practiced. June's smile faltered, but she didn't press. Instead, she brought him a mug of warm milk and let him retreat to the couch, where Coda promptly climbed up beside him, curling his body protectively around the boy. Jonah watched from the kitchen doorway, coffee mug in hand. His instinct as a cop was to confront, to dig, to demand the truth. But instinct as a guardian told him patience was the sharper tool. He took out his leather-bound notebook, jotting down what he had seen, the whispering, the bandages, the silence of the other children. Every detail mattered. Later that night, Jonah found Evan sitting on the floor of his room, a small robot toy clutched in his hands. Coda lay stretched beside him, head resting on his paws. The boy glanced up when Jonah leaned against the doorframe. "You know," Jonah said quietly, "Coda doesn't like secrets. He's got this nose, can sniff out anything, lies, fear, even leftover pizza." That earned the faintest smile from Evan, a quick flicker across his face before it vanished. "He always knows when I'm scared," the boy whispered. He stroked Coda's fur, his voice barely audible. Sometimes, when she whispers, I wish he was there. Jonah's chest tightened, but he kept his expression steady. Then maybe we should make sure he is, he replied, his tone gentle but firm. It was a small exchange, just a handful of words. But it was a beginning. In that quiet bedroom, with Kota pressed against Evan's side, the boy had admitted what he hadn't been able to say to anyone else, that something was wrong. From then on, the bond between the three of them deepened. Jonah noticed how Evan began to mirror Kota's confidence, standing a little taller when the dog walked beside him. He also saw how Kota seemed to sense the boy's moods, placing his paw on Evan's knee when he grew anxious, or positioning himself between Evan and the world when fear crept in. June, too, picked up on the changes. One evening, she whispered to Jonah in the kitchen while Evan and Kota worked on a puzzle in the living room. He's opening up to you, she said, to both of you. Maybe this is how we'll get to the truth, not by pushing, but by letting him know he's safe. Jonah nodded, though unease still gnawed at him. Safety was fragile, and the shadow of classroom 4B loomed large. He knew predators thrived in silence, and silence was exactly what Ms. Hollowell had built around her students. But with each shared glance, each whispered word, each small act of trust, Evan was beginning to let Jonah and Kota in. And once trust took root, truth wouldn't be far behind. The house on Pine Street grew quiet after Evan went to bed, his small form tucked under the blanket with Kota curled faithfully at his feet. June washed dishes in the kitchen, her humming soft but tinged with worry. Jonah sat at the dining table, the leather notebook open, pages filled with the neat, disciplined handwriting of a man who had lived too long by procedure. The lamplight threw sharp shadows across his face, deepening the lines carved there not by age, but by years of carrying weight no badge could lighten. His mind wandered back to that night in the hospital hallway, the night he made a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Evan's mother, Rachel Parker, had lain pale and frail in the sterile bed, the monitors beeping, slowing to a cruel rhythm. She had clasped Jonah's hand with surprising strength for someone fading so quickly. "Promise me," she had whispered, eyes brimming with fear, not for herself, but for her son. "Don't let him end up alone. Don't let him—" Her voice cracked, and she swallowed hard. "He's all I have." Jonah had bent close, pressing her trembling fingers to his forehead like a vow. "I'll protect him, Rachel, with everything I am." She exhaled one last fragile breath, and in that instant, the promise sank into Jonah's bones, heavier than any oath he'd sworn in uniform. He had seen death before, on the highway, in the line of duty, at the edge of too many crime scenes, but never had it demanded so much from him personally. That was why the sight of Evan flinching under Hollowell's touch hit him like shrapnel. It wasn't just a boy being hurt. It was a promise being betrayed in real time. But Jonah carried his own scars, too. His father had been a man of silence, stern and unyielding, a logger who came home smelling of pine and whiskey. When Jonah was Evan's age, he had longed for a word of praise, a gentle hand on the shoulder. They never came. When his father died suddenly of a heart attack, Jonah realized too late that their entire relationship had been a war of unspoken expectations. That absence shaped him into the man who now sat at the table, stoic, vigilant, but terrified of failing the one boy who needed him to be more than a guardian. Kota stirred from his place near the door, nails tapping against the floorboards as he padded over to Jonah. The dog's amber eyes reflected the lamplight, filled with the same wordless understanding that had carried them through countless nights on patrol. Jonah scratched behind his ears, his hand pausing at the scar that ran jagged along the shepherd's flank. That scar had its own story. 2 years earlier, Kota had taken a knife meant for Jonah during a domestic call gone wrong. The man had been high, delirious, wielding a blade. Kota had lunged, and though Jonah's bullet ended the threat, it was the dog who bore the lasting mark. Jonah never forgot the sound of Kota's yelp, the hot rush of blood against his hands as he carried him into the vet's office. And he never forgot the way Kota, even stitched and sedated, had rested his head against Jonah's chest as if to say, "It's worth it. I'd do it again." That same loyalty now radiated toward Evan. Jonah saw how Kota watched over the boy at night, ears twitching at every sound, body curled like a sentry. It was as if the dog understood that the battlefield had shifted. The war was no longer out on the streets of Redwood Ridge, but inside a fourth-grade classroom. Meanwhile, Evan carried his own hidden wounds. Some showed on his skin, bruises and scrapes that never matched his explanations. But others were buried deeper, in the way he hesitated before answering questions, in the nightmares that pulled small cries from his throat, in the way he clung to Kota like a life raft. One evening, June found him sitting by the window, staring at the moon. "You don't have to be strong all the time," she whispered, brushing his hair back. Evan shook his head. "She says if I tell, no one will believe me." His voice was flat, almost rehearsed, and June's heart broke at the realization that those words had been pressed into him like bruises on the soul. That night, when she told Jonah, his jaw clenched so tightly that veins stood out along his temple. But he didn't storm off or make threats. He simply opened his notebook and wrote down Evan's words in careful script. Evidence. Every piece mattered. The past, it seemed, bound all three of them, man, boy, and dog, invisible threads of pain and survival. Jonah with his father's silence and a dying woman's plea. Evan with the loss of his mother and the quiet cruelty of a teacher. Kota with the scar that marked both sacrifice and loyalty. They were a trio shaped by wounds, but together they formed something unbreakable. The next step, Jonah knew, would be dangerous. To confront Hollowell would mean exposing Evan, risking more pain. But to remain silent was unthinkable. As the autumn wind rattled the window panes, Jonah closed his notebook and looked toward the hallway where Evan slept. "We'll end this," he murmured to Kota, who lifted his head in solemn agreement. No more whispers, no more bruises. The dog's tail thumped once against the floorboards, a quiet oath. The past had written their scars, but the future, Jonah swore, would be theirs to rewrite. The first frost of November glazed Redwood Ridge, the morning air sharp with the promise of winter. Jonah's patrol truck rolled to a quiet stop outside the elementary school, his eyes scanning the grounds with the reflexive vigilance of a man who had survived ambushes before. Children streamed past him, their laughter rising in visible puffs of breath. But among them, Evan walked slower, shoulders hunched under the straps of his backpack, eyes fixed on the ground. Kota padded at Jonah's side, tail stiff, ears alert. Something was building. Jonah could feel it the way a storm announces itself in the bones of old trees. Inside classroom 4B, Ms. Vivian Hollowell stood before the whiteboard, her pristine blouse tucked sharply into a pencil skirt, the silver chain around her neck catching the light. Her smile was wide, but her eyes carried the edge of a blade. She dictated multiplication problems with a sweetness that dripped like syrup and stung like vinegar. "Eyes up, Mr. Parker," she said suddenly, her voice soft but loaded, cutting through the room like a whip. Evan startled, fumbling with his pencil. A ripple of muffled giggles moved across the class, quickly silenced by her glare. She leaned down, close enough that only he could hear. "If you humiliate me again, you'll wish you'd stayed home with your dead mother." Evan's throat closed. His fingers tightened on the pencil until the wood splintered. From the back row, Liam Chen's small recorder glowed red in his desk. He had placed it there deliberately that morning, his pulse racing with both fear and determination. Every cruel word was etched onto its memory, but Hollowell sensed dissent. Her eyes flickered over the students, pausing on Liam's rigid posture. She moved down the aisle, her heels clicking against the linoleum. "You seem distracted, Liam," she purred, placing a manicured hand on his shoulder. He froze, praying she wouldn't look inside his desk. At that same moment, out in the hallway, Jonah signed the visitor's log and started toward the classroom. Kota trotted at his heel, his body low, a quiet growl reverberating in his chest. The dog's instincts often outpaced Jonah's. He knew something was wrong even before Jonah turned the handle. Inside, Evan's moment of breaking arrived. During art time, when paintbrushes clattered into jars and colors spilled across the paper, his trembling hand knocked over the water cup again. Crimson paint bled into his drawing, a house with 3 figures holding hands. Hollowell's face hardened. She swept across the room, stooping so low her perfume stung his nose. "Pathetic," she hissed, "always ruining things, just like your mother." And then, with 2 fingers, she pinched his cheek hard enough to draw tears, a smile frozen on her lips for the watching class. The silence in the room thickened. No one dared to move, except Evan. Something inside him, brittle and exhausted, cracked. His chair screeched against the floor as he bolted upright, tears streaking his face. "Stop it!" His voice cracked, but the words rang loud enough to startle even himself. The door slammed open. Jonah stood framed by the hallway light, his broad shoulders blocking the doorway. Kota pressed forward with a growl that silenced the room. Hollowell straightened instantly, mask sliding back into place. But her fingers still rested on Evan's cheek, leaving angry red marks. "Is there a problem, Officer Pike?" she asked, honey dripping from her voice. Jonah's eyes flicked to the boy, to the silent class, to the recorder glinting faintly on Liam's desk. Every instinct screamed to act, but years of training held him steady. He had seen bullies in uniforms behind badges in enemy lines. They all wore the same smirk, and they all broke when exposed to the light. "I'm here for my son," Jonah said calmly, his voice carrying an authority deeper than his badge. "And I'll be back." Hollowell's lips twitched. She knew. He knew. The children knew. That night, the Alliance came together in Jonah's living room. June sat with Claire Bennett, the school nurse, who spread medical records across the coffee table. Rosa Ortiz, the counselor, unfolded slips of anonymous notes from terrified children. Liam's mother, Anna Gomez, handed over the recorder, her hands trembling but resolute. Jonah laid his notebook down last. "We have enough to bring her down, but we'll need to move carefully." At the far end of the couch, Evan sat with Kota's head in his lap. His eyes were red, but for the first time in weeks, He didn't look away when Jonah met his gaze. "You believe me?" he whispered. Jonah knelt in front of him, resting a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "I always did. Now we'll make them believe too." The war for Classroom 4B had begun. The gymnasium had been converted into a makeshift hearing chamber, its echoing walls hung with the school's banners. Pride, honor, respect, but the words looked hollow under the buzzing fluorescent lights. Parents, teachers, and members of the school board filled the folding chairs, their whispers weaving through the air like dry leaves. At the center, a long table stood like a tribunal bench. Ms. Vivian Hollowell sat with perfect posture, her smile rehearsed, her lipstick a precise crimson slash. To her left, her union representative shuffled papers, confident that without bruises or broken bones, the complaints would crumble. On the opposite side sat Jonah, June, Nurse Claire, Counselor Rosa, Anna Gomez, and young Liam. Evan clung to Coda's thick fur under the table, his small fingers tangling in the shepherd's coat. The dog sat upright, calm but alert, the weight of the room anchored in his steady presence. The chair of the board, Mr. Halpern, cleared his throat. "We're here to examine allegations of misconduct against Ms. Hollowell. Evidence will be presented. Testimonies will be heard." Hollowell leaned forward, her tone sweet as honey. "My methods may be strict, but they're rooted in discipline and care. Children need boundaries. Officer Pike and his allies are simply misunderstanding firmness as cruelty." The room hummed with uneasy agreement. It might have ended there, another adult's word against frightened children, until Jonah rose. He didn't pound the table or raise his voice. He simply opened his leather notebook and began to read. Dates, times, injuries noted, Evan's changing behavior, every line delivered in the crisp cadence of a man who knew the value of evidence. He laid the notebook down with finality. Then Claire spread out her medical reports. Repeat injuries too consistent to be accidents. Rosa followed with slips of crumpled paper written in shaky handwriting. "She hurts us when no one looks." "I'm scared of her." Hollowell's smile thinned, but she held her composure. "Anonymous scribbles. Children exaggerate." Ana Gomez stood, voice trembling but fierce. "Not when my son risked everything to record her." She placed Liam's recorder on the table, pressed play, and the room fell silent. The voice that spilled from the speaker was venom wrapped in sugar. "Lai cham chap gyong me mai phai kong." The hiss cut through the gym like broken glass. Gasps erupted from the audience. Another clip followed, her mocking laughter on the phone. "Chung chi la lu tre con, I ma tin chung chu." Parents stiffened. Teachers looked down in shame. Hollowell's face drained of color. And then Evan, trembling, stood. His knees shook, but Jonah's steady hand rested lightly on his shoulder. The boy's voice cracked but carried across the room. She told me I was worthless. She said my mom was nothing." Tears welled, but he lifted his chin. "But my mom was everything, and I don't want any more kids to feel the way I felt." Silence. A silence so deep it pressed on the lungs of everyone there. Even Kota seemed to hold his breath, his gaze fixed on the board as if willing them to hear the truth. Hollowell's representative fumbled for words, but there was nothing left to defend. The board members exchanged grim glances. Mr. Halpern's voice was steady. "Effective immediately, Ms. Hollowell is suspended pending termination. Further investigation will be forwarded to the State Licensing Board." The gavel struck. The sound cracked like thunder, but to Evan, It was the sweetest sound he'd ever heard. The boy collapsed against Jonah's chest, sobbing. Jonah wrapped his arms around him, his jaw tight, eyes shining with a pride he'd never dared show before. Kota pressed close, resting his head on Evan's lap, a silent guardian sealing the moment. Parents approached, some apologizing, some thanking Evan for his courage, but he only whispered into Jonah's shirt, "Is it really over?" Jonah kissed the crown of his hair. "It's over. You're safe now." For the first time in months, Evan believed it. The boy who once shrank under whispered cruelty now stood taller, shielded not just by a foster father and a K-9, but by a truth that could no longer be silenced. Winter loosened its grip on Redwood Ridge. The first buds appeared on the aspens, and with them came a quiet warmth that seemed to seep not just into the soil, but into the people who had carried the long weight of silence. Classroom 4B looked different now. Gone was the heavy hush that once stifled laughter. Under the gentle guidance of Mr. Aaron Keller, the room bloomed with color. Children's artwork taped along the walls, science projects sprouting in the corners, and a jar of pencils on every desk, never withheld as punishment. The students had begun to raise their hands again, voices overlapping in the messy, joyful way of childhood. Evan sat in the second row, his shoulders straighter, his eyes brighter. When called upon, he didn't flinch. He spoke, sometimes softly, but without fear. And on one extraordinary morning, he even volunteered to read aloud. His classmates listened, not with pity, but with respect, the kind reserved for someone who had walked through fire and come out stronger. At home, the changes were quieter, but no less profound. One evening, Jonah found Evan asleep on the couch. Kota sprawled at his feet, the boy's notebook open with a sketch of 3 figures, a man, a boy, and a dog, standing under the words, "My family." Jonah felt the sting of tears, rare and unguarded, as he tucked a blanket around the boy. June, watching from the kitchen doorway, whispered, "You've given him back his childhood." Jonah shook his head. "No," he said softly. "He gave me back something too." In that small house on Pine Street, healing took the shape of ordinary moments. Evan laughing at Kota's clumsy chase of a tennis ball, June humming while making pancakes, Jonah helping with math homework at the worn dining table. There were still bad dreams sometimes, nights when Evan woke in tears. But now he had arms to run into, hands to hold, and a dog's steady warmth pressed close until sleep returned. On the last day of school before summer, Jonah arrived early to pick Evan up. As the children poured out of the building, Evan ran toward him, his backpack bouncing, his grin wide and unguarded. "Dad!" he called. One word, simple and unplanned, but heavy with meaning. Jonah froze for a heartbeat, then knelt to catch him in a fierce embrace, Kota circling them with a wagging tail. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Jonah, Evan, and Kota walked along the ridge trail. The sky blazed with gold and crimson, a promise painted across the horizon. Evan slipped his hand into Jonah's, his other hand holding Kota's leash. For the first time in a long time, the boy did not look back in fear. He looked forward, and Jonah, with the weight of his promise finally kept, whispered a vow into the cooling wind. No more shadows, only light from here. The story of Classroom 4B ended not with a gavel, not with punishment, but with renewal. Proof that courage could be found in the smallest voices, that loyalty could walk on 4 legs, and that sometimes the bravest act of all was simply to believe a child. When Officer Jonah Pike and his loyal K-9 walked into classroom 4B, he thought he was just picking up his foster son. Instead, he uncovered whispers of cruelty that no one else dared to face. What happened next exposed the truth, broke the silence, and changed a little boy's life forever.